So a couple years ago, I saw a post where in the void of the internet where someone suggested it would have been an amazing idea to have characters start out with blank character sheets and have to figure out what they could do and what classes they were. I saw this idea and said, I can make this happen. Mind you, I had never DM'd before, except a massively failed attempt in college playing Vampire: The Dark Ages. I still shudder at those memories. My DM at the time wanted to take a little break, so I asked if I could give it a shot with an idea I've been planning for weeks and weeks, just for this occasion. He said yes, and so the madness began. Warning, this'll be long. We were still using 3.5 system at the time. I asked each player individually what kind of character they would like to play. I then made characters for each one that were exact opposite of what they wanted and usually wanted to play D&D, without telling them, of course. I then said they got to choose the name of their characters and that was it. So each came to the first session with a blank character sheet with their PC's name on it. They all woke up in identical robes in a strange stone table that pulsed with a strange purple light. They all looked at each other and were able to inform each other of their physical features, which I divulged. There was a human, a half-elf, an elf, and a halfling. They then tried to see if they recognized each other. With their roles, they weren't sure, but for some reason they remembered their names. That's when I made them switch sheets with each player opposite of them, or the character sitting across from the table. This led to some hilarious mix-ups, as two players had the throwaway names of Adzip, pizza backwards, and Dildo Writer. One player said his character really hated his parents as he glared at the player who had written the name. The characters had been woken from some kind of trance by a raggedy, homeless-looking man who, it seemed, had somehow smashed open a wall to their seeming prison. He didn't remember his own name, but mumbled something about he knew he needed to help them. The characters then began to inspect the strange place they found themselves. Outside their room, they found a series of tunnels carved perfectly out of some strange stone that also pulsed with the same light as their room for confinement. Runes on the wall were inscrutable to them. Having armed themselves with some armor and weapons from some bodies in the tunnels, they proceeded. The ragged man who remained beside them, covered in beard and clothing so old they were bleached from sun and time, carried only a staff and a wooden splint that stretched across his other forearm. He refused any other armament. They found there were many other rooms, each with plaques outside giving bizarre descriptions of what lay within. Many said things such as sacrifices, followed by a number. Some said things like vermin and contained a company of goblins who woke up and fought them. Others, such as willing sacrifices, contained soldiers of identical uniforms, though these seemed to have retained their memories and attacked the party immediately, screaming something about dying for their great leader. The party, meanwhile, tried to figure out what they could even do. Each encounter was a chance to try out their physical capabilities. The halfling, through good intelligence checks and handling of daggers, figured he was a rogue. The robust man found he must be a warrior class of some kind. The half-elf, convinced he was wizarding powers, attempted to cast a spell. I had him roll a d20, which I could see if he randomly cast one of the quote-unquote wizard spells he had. But rather than cast magic missile, he conjured water above the enemy's head. "Ah," he said, "so I'm a cleric of some kind." I had built a system for them to get back their stats and see what they could do. Each time a character rolled a nat 20, for any reason whatsoever, I said he had a flashback of inspiration and revelations and could choose one of three things. 1. A stat for their sheet apart from their level. 2. An ability or spell. Or 3. a memory of their character's past. This led to hilarious mishaps where one character found that he had decent HP and figured he must be a fighter. I gave them no blatant indications of their actual levels. He then charged a beefy undead monster with a sword. His roll, plus his proficiency, led to the following.
You realize you've never used one of these before in your life. Your swing is so slow and unbalanced that the creature grabs the blade and tosses aside your weapon. Roll for embarrassment.
Turns out, he was a sorcerer, but his level was so high he thought he had the HP of a fighter. The party also realized that upon rolling a nat 1, worse things could happen besides simply crit failing. Every PC or even NPC upon rolling a 1 had to do a roll-off with something. If they rolled less, the walls or floors would seemingly try to eat them. The material of the tunnel was the cause of much discussion. Upon injuring the stone, it would eventually heal itself. With a good enough perception roll, the light would seem to pulse like a heartbeat. There were several theories from amongst the players as to where they were, and one player was adamant that they were dead, especially as one memory was of him taking a blade through the chest in some great battle. Some memories caused even more consternation in the party. The halfling recalled an argument with the human barbarian, yelling something about promises that his village would be protected and then lunging at him with a dagger. The barbarian recalled a wife and child, but was torn by the fact that he couldn't remember what had happened to them. The sorcerer recalled seeing the priest embrace a beautiful elf maiden who he knew and loved very much. The priest recalled his own office in flames and the sorcerer throwing him out a window. Tensions grew in the party and distrust was sown. It became equally as likely for players to want memories as much as abilities and stats. To cut a long story short, the party found that the quote-unquote facility, as they called it, branched from the central chamber into 4 separate main passages, each ending with a realm. Some seemingly impossible magical forces had taken chunks of the realms of earth, fire, air, and water and implanted them at the 4 corners. Upon passing through a bizarre barrier, the party would enter the realm. Eventually, they would find an orb at the center, which, upon being taken, would cause the realm to collapse into the orb. Through various clues and notes scattered throughout their travels, the party found that the realms were the key to the destruction of the facility. 3 of these realms were obtained after killing their guardians for the orbs. The 4th had already been taken by a beholder. He was wearing a bow tie and kept talking to an imaginary friend named Kevin. Seemingly insane, the party was forced to fight it. Upon its destruction, one party member secretly found the bow tie. Upon wearing it, they found themselves overwhelmed by the spirit of the
Great and powerful Kevin.
He was a wizard who gleefully tried to take over the host's body in exchange for a taste of his raw magical power. Kevin was continuously frustrated as no one could remember him, even after history checks where 2 party members made nat 20s. He has been a running gag who's appeared in every one of my members' campaign at some point. I'm always frustrated that no one has ever heard of him, no matter how high they roll. As they journeyed, the party encountered several other things that told them something of their past. They all had been trying to stop the big bad evil guy who had been conquering all of their homelands. He was human, non-magical, but his prowess, tactical genius, and overall charisma inspired near fanatical devotion from his followers. Some of his soldiers, they found, were heard screaming, "He is a god!" before they died, or killed themselves rather than talk. Writings from his second-in-command showed that he was encouraging his worship behind his back, as well as working on some secret endeavor involving a great many captured slaves and willing servants of the big bad evil guy. There was also an older record of an ancient construction, perhaps before we all knew people ever inhabited this region, and that it was the key to ending all of this foolish conflict. After the party encountered the door labeled the Traitors, they fought powerful NPCs that knew each of them. However, the party was too good at killing them before they could get anything important out of them, apart from one raging barbarian claiming to be the PC's brother, who gleefully whispered that it was he who led them to the halfling's village, as he choked to death on his own blood. Not knowing what this meant, the party's barbarian kept it to himself. The party began to dream as well as gain new memories. Each recalled a grand battle with massive armies on both sides. Most recalled fighting the big bad evil guy themselves before being terribly wounded or possibly dying. No one person was entirely sure. The ragged man in their party, nicknamed Paladin because the party members said they reminded him of an image of a god from a mythology who went by the same name, was talked about rather profusely behind his back. When few people were looking, he would sometimes display rather immense strength. One party member saw him kill a zombie by backhanding it, causing its head to corkscrew around. Though he was continuously bloodied and beaten down horribly, he always seemed to recover. Some suspected he acted weaker than he really was, but again, no one was sure. One encounter left him staying behind to hold off a fire-breathing hydra. When he came stumbling back to them, everyone wanted to know why he was covered in blood and if the hydra was still chasing them. His answer was inadequate. One party member was sure that he knew him from some point, but the immense beard and long ragged hair made it impossible to tell. Party members also found that when they slept closest to the paladin, they dreamed of him. They all had to piece it together as each had different dreams, but the vision started with the paladin crawling out of the surface from under a mass pile of corpses, standing before some powerful female deity, being given his splint and staff, and then being dragged under the earth to emerge next to the very door that led to the room of their imprisonment. Two party members believed he might be the king of a city they recalled inhabiting, as no one could remember what happened after the big bad evil guy sacked it and burned it to the ground. He himself did not seem to remember anything other than he's been tasked with helping them in some way. At one point, when they found the trophy room of the big bad evil guys, he wept and cried at depictions of the army's destruction of the village and towns, the suffering he caused. Each PC found trophies taken from places they remembered. The halfling found a burnt remains of his village, which he remembered going up in flames. The cleric recalled a hospital he had founded that was destroyed. The sorcerer, a magic school in which he was the headmaster. And the barbarian found trinkets taken from his village, especially the headband that his wife had worn that was now stained with dried blood. His eyes burning, he tied it to his forehead. Finally, after they brought all the ores back to the main chamber, they concluded that they had to be smashed, and prayed that those inside, especially the dryads from the Earth Realm, who several remember being incredibly hot, would survive. Upon their destruction, cries of relief filled the room, and the central circle of the room began to descend. The party eventually found floor panels that made it go up and down. They stopped on one floor, and the party discovered the final trophy room of the big bad evil guy. Paladin had gone ahead and entered first. They heard his inhuman scream of horror. Running to save him from some terrible danger, They instead found him shredding the last of a painting on the wall before he ran wailing down the halls with pieces clutched in his fist. No one could restrain him. The party could make no sense of it, especially as the painting could not be reassembled. They rolled awfully. Meanwhile, they found items that had belonged specifically to them, labeled and all. Upon touching them, all their memories came flooding back. The barbarian had been a chief of his village, and had led a resistance against the big bad evil guy. His village was eventually attacked when he was gone, his wife murdered and daughter taken. It was then he had taken on the strange tattoos on his face, the lines around his eyes symbolizing his grief. The halfling was the main assassin of the barbarian's resistance and reported only to him. In exchange for killing lieutenants of the big bad evil guy, his village was to be kept hidden and protected from the big bad evil guy's agents. Upon a great betrayal, and the halfling village being burnt to the ground, survivors never be found, the halfling had stabbed the barbarian in rage. The barbarian had taken the blow and held his friend as he wept with him for all they had lost. The cleric recalled coming from near homeless backgrounds, but his dedication to life and his goddess, who favored lost causes, healing, and redemption, would lead him to master his art, and with permission from the king and the headmaster of the local and prestigious school of magic, founded his hospital. He eventually fell in love with the headmaster's sister, who, after his initial disagreements, was supportive. The cleric was a half-elf, and the high-born pure-blood elven sorcerer was resistant to a half-breed courting one of his family. When the spies infiltrated the city, burning the hospital, the sorcerer himself rushed in to save the cleric. Upon finding him trapped in his office and choking on smoke, he threw him out the window before casting spells to ensure his safe landing. His sister was then discovered to be missing. Spies eventually destroyed the School of Magic before the big bad evil guy's forces marched in and put the whole city to the torch. The heroes helped band together the scattered survivors of the onslaught and destruction of their homes, and launched a desperate assault upon the big bad evil guy. The armies met, and all the PCs remembered being taken down in one form or another before they woke up in the facility. The barbarian and the halfling did recall dueling the big bad evil guy who, though he wiped the floor with them, was wounded terribly before they blacked out. Taking their new, old arms in their hands, they concluded that they had to descend to the bottom and destroy the big bad evil guy and end the evil of this place once and for all. After their final descent, they came across a throne, made of the same strange material as all the rest of the tunnels through which they had journeyed. All the lines, all the ruins, all the lights came together with it at the epicenter. Upon the throne sat a lich. The party hurled accusations, threats, and challenges to the big bad evil guy, who simply laughed that they didn't even know whom it was they were fighting. He had seen the big bad evil guy killed and had him thrown into the mass grave, along with many of the dead from the last battle. This entire structure in which they stood would feed him with the lives and all those that had been caged within it, as he fed upon their memories, their souls, the energies of all their combined power. The lich stood and raised his hands. The light of the chamber pulsed brighter than ever, and the party heard screams cascade down from the very walls above their heads. Listening checks discovered that they may have heard voices that were recognizable, and it fueled their righteous fury. An epic battle began. The Lich summoned demonic minions, conjured destructible barriers against all elements which had to be beaten down before they could even damage him, and flew around the room as he taunted the party. Large impacts shook the room every now and then, causing dust to fall from the ceiling far above them. The Lich seemed perplexed at this, before a figure in shining armor crashed through the ceiling and tackled him to the ground. As he stood up, the party recognized him at last. He was Paladin. But even more than that, he was the big bad evil guy they had been looking for. But now his armor depicted the likeness of the cleric's goddess. She had resurrected him, given him the armor, sword, and shield he now wielded, which had been disguised as rags, a staff, and a wooden splint. His goal was to aid those whom he had caused great suffering and redeem himself, though he still did not remember who he was until he had seen the painting of himself upon the wall, and it all came flooding back. The party's own actions and treatments of him throughout the campaign affected who he now became, and if they had turned evil, the campaign would have ended very differently. Words were exchanged between the big bad evil guy and his own second-in-command. Apparently, the big bad evil guy had simply wanted to unite all beneath him for the sake of peace, but the other had fed him false intelligence. The barbarians ate the slain. The halflings were all trained assassins. The king was a tyrant whose kingdom was built on slaves. The enemy combatants had attacked first, and so forth. So many lies had infuriated the big bad evil guy that therefore his army and his anger he had commanded them to take no prisoners and torture any who were surrendered and had been captured. Meanwhile, his second-in-command had gained spies and traitors from amongst the various factions in the region to help break them all down one after another, preparing for his master's great strike. It was he who secretly dealt with all the prisoners and reported back what he had learned, sparing most of them from death of his own uses. It was he who used sweet words and his web of influential spells to tip everything towards his own designs. All so that, in the end, a horde of slaves would be led into the caverns he had spent decades studying, and would use all of them and various incantations to transform himself into a powerful lich. His phylacteries were the realms themselves, painstakingly harnessed and powered the facility itself. Paladin launched himself at his former friend, now the new big bad evil guy. However, new events caught his attention. On a word of command, a wall opened, revealing a gargantuan red dragon. Another pawn chained to the facility, now unleashed in a desperate attempt to stop the party. Paladin took on the dragon, which rampaged across the battlefield. This was an interesting mechanic, as he became a hazard that had to be avoided as the party battled the big bad evil guy. The party was getting worn down. Eventually, one party member was at negative hit points and attempting to stabilize. Another was petrified. And the rest looked like they were about to die. The sorcerer then realized the lich had been casting the delayed fireball spell many times during the combat, and there were several tiny beads laid strewn on the battlefield. For those unfamiliar with the spell, the beads appear where more powerful fireball spells will eventually go at the will of the caster, but they can be moved by someone who sees them and can be destroyed. After he informed Rogue, the beads were thrown at the big bad evil guy and detonated prematurely, finally killing him in a tremendous explosion. Purple light cascaded out of him as he screamed in agony. The dragon was then finished off and beheaded. In the end, hundreds of captured people were set free. The barbarian was reunited with his daughter, the sorcerer's sister reunited with her brother, and the cleric, her true love. And the halfling found that a surprising amount of his family and village did survive, though many were gone. There were emotional moments all around. Meanwhile, Paladin was surrounded by a brilliant light, told that he had done well, but the blood on his hands was not yet washed clean. He had other work to be done. With that, he was gone, and with him ended my first campaign ever.